The main reason that despite my interest in politics, I tend to tune out of the news cycle is that engaging in politics has become unenjoyable and borderline depressing. There, I am sure to find bipartisan approval. Not even grandma wants politics at her dinner table. The main reason for the sorry state of politics is that there is no real communication between the people that disagree with each other. And because there is no communication, there is also no understanding between the different political camps. These political camps tend to isolate themselves and then they start buying their own bullshit. This process of separation is present in all places where there is a political struggle, and the result is always a sort of cold civil war. A war fought with ideas, propaganda, and the occasional violence. The sort of communication that does take place normally devolves into a self-righteous screaming match, the exact scenario that Grandma wanted to avoid. But why is this? Why is it so difficult to have good conversations with the people who disagree with us? And is there a solution?
ובחרי לך שני מאנשי גונדתי עלי בריקדות נתפגש עלי בריקדות חירות נישא בדם ואש.
The fundamental problem with political conversations is that we do not understand each other at a visceral level. I have gone ahead and read Marx. I understand the theory in my head, but the liberation of the proletariat does not inspire any passion in me. So when I talk to a passionate revolutionary, he might as well be an alien as far as I'm concerned. Not because we are different species or have different ways of thinking, but the difference lies in our passions. Our passionate feelings, anger, joy, disgust, fear, desire, etc., they are not objective, and they depend on the way that we look at the world. If you are playing a football match and your team scores, you will feel joy, while a player of the other team will feel anger and disappointment. You two are witnessing the same event, but you have opposite definitions of good. Your definition of good is that your team wins, and every time that you get closer to winning, by scoring for example, you will feel good, while your opponent will feel bad because his idea of good is that his own team wins. Your emotions will be dependent on your ultimate goal, and communication with people with other different goals will be as difficult as convincing a member of the other team that he should actually be cheering when your team scores. Our passionate revolutionary has a different conception of good than I do. As a result, we cannot directly sympathize with each other. Quite the opposite. We see each other with confusion and soon enough with disgust and hate. Every single emotion, behind every single action, is dependent on our ideas about good and evil. So before there can be any communication between political opponents, there needs to be visceral empathy. I need to feel what he feels. I need to be able to look at the world with the same red tinge that he does. This true understanding cannot come from the head. We can understand each other logically, but logic is cold and it does not inspire any empathy. Therefore, if we want real communication, we need to understand the ideology of another person and how he uses this ideology to comprehend how the world works around him. The main point of this essay is to address the rarely talked about but essential connection between philosophy and political thought, and how the lack of philosophy in politics will inevitably lead to superficiality and much worse. But first, we need to take a look what an ideology is and how it works. And that means that we have to look at the three components of any ideology: the politics, the ethics, and the core philosophy. An ideology is a set of beliefs that attempt to interpret the world through a specific group of ideas. The world is big and complex, beyond the capacity of any person to understand it all at once. In order not to be overwhelmed by complexity, we simplify the world, interpreting reality through a specific lens. We all have our personal ideology, and we cannot escape it. An individual will always have a way to interpret reality, and since we are social beings, we learn how to interpret the world from the people around us. This means that ideologies not only determine the conduct of the individual, but also the character of society. The outermost layer of any ideology is politics. Politics can be defined as the organized pursuit of power. At the most basic level, it is bashing each other's heads in with a club. He who bashes hardest wins and becomes king. What we do nowadays is just different in execution. We have less clubbing and more speeches. We build armies of millions of voters every couple of years, count heads, but never fight. But the principle remains unchanged. Politics is and will always be about chasing power, by any means necessary. Political power is just the capacity to move society in a certain direction, but like all tools, it is not an end, but a means. Political power always serves our ethical judgments. An ethical judgment is a statement that something is desirable or undesirable. For example, X is good because it increases our GDP. Y is bad because it harms others. And to do Z is evil. All political action comes from an attempt to implement these ethical judgments, whatever they may be. Maybe their aim is to feed the megalomania of the leader, to maintain the status quo, or to implement great changes in society. The point is that if we want to understand the political actions of a movement, we have to look at its ethical system. To use a typical example, let's take the abortion debate. Pro-death people will argue that having a child is a choice, and having the liberty to make one's choices is fundamentally good. Anti-choice people believe that life is fundamentally valuable, and since aborting a baby is ending a life, it is evil. This is a stage where most conversations break down because ethical judgments are not flexible. In order to stop grandstanding and to actually have a conversation, one has to go one level deeper and ask what is good and what is bad. If one side values life more than liberty and the other one disagrees, the only thing to do is to descend into philosophy and ask the fundamental questions like, why is liberty good? Or does life have any value in itself? Our ethics depend on the fundamental way that we look at the world. Your philosophical beliefs will always predetermine your ethical judgments. All honest and interesting political conversations will go from politics to ethics to philosophy or die trying. There lies the great tragedy of our political discourse. The great majority of conversations will never reach philosophy, so most political conversations will not even get close to understanding, much less convincing the other person. The base of any ideology is its philosophical thought that supports its ethical system. The philosophical thought is nothing more than the subjective way that this ideology defines what is good and what is bad. The underlying philosophy is normally the least addressed but most important part of any ideology. All ideologies are large intellectual systems made up of thousands of arguments and dozens of books, but at the core, an ideology is just an attempt to define what is good. So the most interesting question in political thought is, how do we define good? The world is amoral. It is just a lot of matter in motion, and the people around us are just very complex chemical processes. But nobody sees it that way. Instead, we see things in a moral dimension. We describe some things as good and others as bad. And it is this differentiation that is the source of all of our actions. We naturally strive towards the good and away from the bad. We make the subjective distinction of good and bad based on the values that we hold. A value is some abstract concept that we accept as inherently good. For example, justice or equality. We all have values that we care for, but some are more important to us than others. This hierarchy of values reveals itself when we have to make an ethical decision. Under enough pressure, every person will capitulate all of their values except one uncompromisable value that guides their lives and is their definition of ultimate good. Why can no one agree if something is good or bad in politics? Simply put, because my highest idea of good is not your highest idea of good. Because my highest value is not your highest value. And therefore, we will interpret the world differently, and this difference between the two is not reconcilable. A socialist's highest value can be equality, and he will interpret the world accordingly. Everything that makes the world more equal is good, and everything that makes it less equal is bad. How can there be any reconciliation between this worldview and one that places, say, competence as its highest value? That's right, there cannot be any. The highest value that each person takes depends on their personality, on their experiences, and their environment. But this decision is not rational, and it cannot be justified because there is no higher good to justify this decision to. So a person's highest value, in a certain sense, is irrational. A socialist cannot tell you why equality is good, he can only tell you that it is. All of our ideologies and moral systems are fundamentally irrational because at their core they have a subjective value judgment that cannot be justified. This irrational core of all ideologies cannot be understood outside of talking about it at a philosophical level. All political movements consider themselves rational, but understanding between people who belong to different movements can only really happen when they acknowledge that they are irrational in different ways. A good political conversation is always about understanding each other's subjective values. However, it is very difficult to bring a political conversation into philosophy, because in order to have a conversation, a good conversation, with a political opponent, you need to have three things. First, trust and goodwill between both parties. Second, the speakers need to know what they are talking about, and they must be familiar with each other's arguments. And third, an occasion where this conversation can develop. The reason that these three conditions are so rare to see is that they are of no benefit. Our political systems work on a quantity over quality system. The number of votes is all that matters. In order to maximize this number, political movements rely on propaganda that encourages fanatism and party loyalty. After all, we are the good ones, and our opponents are literally evil. The sad reality is that the most effective way to mobilize your supporters is to take complex political situations and simplify them into Marvel-level narratives. That means that to win, you have to portray your opponents as villains who torture puppies in their spare time. After you demonize your opponents, you simply cannot sit down with them and have a heart-to-heart. You can also not really have any trust or goodwill with the people that you fucking dehumanize. As long as political parties fight for votes, they will demonize their enemies. And if you think that the ideology of your enemies is something extracted from pure black tar evil, then you should stay away and not even engage with their ideas under any circumstances. Finally, the occasions where political opponents do meet are not optimal for a conversation. Instead, they are optimal for having a debate. As an avid participant in my local debate team, I will tell you that although debating is fun, nobody has ever changed their minds because their opponents defeated them with fact and logic in a debate. When you are debating someone, you're having a verbal duel. Like a gladiator, you're looking for weaknesses and exploiting them. Any argument that you can strawman is a win. Any chance you get to go in to indirectly call them stupid or evil is a win. And of course, you should not expose your own weaknesses or concede a single point to your opponent. You are infallibly right, and they are undoubtedly wrong. The whole point of a debate is to humiliate your opponent and win over the crowd. But in most cases, you get two idiots talking past each other, and their respective fans mindlessly cheering for their side. That is, of course, what Grandma really does not want to see at her dinner table, and why politics is also such an ugly business. Because the left cannot understand the right, libertarians cannot understand authoritarians, and the centrists cannot understand any of them. When we do not want to understand each other, we cannot have an honest conversation with each other, and then all that we have left is debate. So what is the main difference between a debate and a conversation? The difference lies in the goal. In a debate, your goal is to gain political power by humiliating your opponent. And in an honest conversation, the shared goal of both participants is to find the truth. That is what philosophy is, right? What is philosophy other than people sharing their ideas in the pursuit of truth? To have an honest conversation, you need to engage in philosophy. And when you have a debate, you will engage in sophistry. And so we realize that we have not really changed in the 2,400 years since Socrates was discussing with the sophists. The sophists of Athens engaged in rhetoric in the pursuit of power and personal benefit, while Socrates engaged in philosophy for the sake of truth and was democratically executed for it. Our political system is a system of organized sophistry because the goal of political action is not to find truth, but to achieve victory, to acquire power by any means necessary. The result in our world is the same as in Athens. The sophists win and the philosophers lose. Debate outcompetes conversation, and honest politicians are facing extinction because they simply cannot keep up. There are also millions that pretend to be like Socrates, philosophers in the search for the ultimate truth. But there are millions of sophists LARPing as Socrates, while they push their own ideology forward. And I will also not pretend to be like Socrates. I am a sophist. I started this project and write these essays because I want to spread my ideas. The only difference between me and the rest is that I am honest about it, and I think that my stuff is better quality. If you truly manage to find a blood and bone philosopher in the 21st century, then please put him in a cage so we can study him. But until then, don't believe the bullshit that other sophists tell you about themselves. In a world dominated by sophistry, there cannot be any political communication, and there cannot be any understanding between people with different values. So what does that leave us with? That leaves us with the reality that political power belongs to the group with the best propaganda and the most tanks. When communication breaks down, that is all that politics is. It is a conflict for the mind of the crowd, a conflict fought with propaganda, demagoguery, and if all else fails, with a rifle.